Welcome back. In this video, we're going to add a chase radius to the enemy so that the enemy will stop trying to chase the character when it gets close enough. We'll see why in a second. We're then going to add more enemies and store the enemies in an array so that it's easier to update them and manipulate them. So let's first see why we need a chase radius. So here's our enemy, and if I stop running, then you'll see that the enemy starts to glitch out when it gets close, and this is because it's reaching its destination and continuing to move as that to-target vector is no longer meaningful when the enemy reaches the character. So let's add that radius now. So we're here in enemy.h, and we're going to add a float called radius. Now I'm going to initialize this to a value of 25.f and see how that goes. Now to use this radius, we're going to go to the enemy's tick function, and just after we've assigned a value to velocity, we can check that velocity's length. Remember, velocity at this point is the vector from the enemy to the character, so the length is the distance between them. We can place an if statement and use vector to length passing in velocity. And we can check to see if velocity is less than the radius. Now, if it is, then we don't want any movement, so we can simply set velocity equal to the 0 vector. Let's run this and see how it goes. So here comes the enemy, and if I let the enemy reach the character, now it's no longer glitching out. Looks great. And this is going to be your final challenge. You're going to create an array of enemy pointers called enemies. Create at least one more enemy variable, just like we did with Goblin. Initialize it and make sure you give it a different location than the Goblin, otherwise they'll just be on top of each other. Store the addresses of these enemies in the array using the address of operator. Now for all the actions we perform on the Goblin, instead we're going to loop through the enemy's array and perform that action on each enemy. Make it easy on yourself by using a range-based for loop. This involves calling setTarget, passing in the address of the knight. It also involves calling the tick function. And finally, in our if mouse button pressed if statement, where we check collision rex with the Goblin, we're going to loop through the enemies and check collision rex for each enemy. And if the weapon collision rec is overlapping with that enemy, we'll call its setAlive function passing in false. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so we've got our Goblin. Let's go ahead and create another enemy. I'm going to create an enemy called Slime. And I'll use a vector 2 for its position, and I'll go ahead and set its position at 500.f, 700.f. Hopefully that's not off the map. And while I'm at it, I'd like to set the Goblin's position to something other than 0, 0. It looks kind of weird starting off in the water like that. So let's give the Goblin, say, 800.f, 300.f. Now for the slime, I'm going to call load texture for the second and third input parameters, and I'll paste in the same thing I loaded for the Goblin, except instead of Goblin idle sprite sheet and Goblin run sprite sheet, I'm going to replace the word Goblin with slime. And that's because we have sprite sheets in our characters folder for a slime character. Here's my semicolon. And now I have two enemies. I'm now ready to create an array. So this will hold enemy pointers, that's type enemy star, and I'm going to call this enemies. Here's my brackets, and I only have two enemies. Now I could put a 2 in here, but the compiler is perfectly capable of deducing the number of elements in an array when you initialize the array with braces like this. So I can simply put these enemies in the braces as a list, starting with the address of the Goblin variable, and then finally the address of the slime variable. And there's my semicolon. So we now have an array of enemies with 2 elements. We now need to call setTarget. So instead of doing this for just the Goblin, we're going to use a range-based for loop. We'll say for auto enemy and enemies, and we'll call enemy setTarget. And we'll pass in the address of the knight variable. So that takes care of setting the target. We now need to scroll down into the while loop where we're calling the enemy's tick function. Here it is, we're calling tick on goblin. Instead, we're going to loop through the enemies. So we're going to say for auto enemy in enemies, and we're going to call enemy tick. These are pointers, so we're using the arrow operator. We'll call tick and pass in get frame time. And finally, here we're checking to see if the mouse button has been pressed. And then we're checking the collision rex. Here we can do another for loop. So just above the if statement, I'll add a for loop. We'll say auto enemy and enemies. And inside this for loop, I'll place the if statement right here. I'll just format the document with Shift-Alt-F. On Mac, it's Shift-Option-F, and on Linux, it's Control-Shift-I, as we've seen before. And instead of checking collision rex on the goblin, we're going to use the enemy. And since this is a pointer, we're using the arrow operator. And if there is a collision, we want to call setAlive not on the goblin, but on the enemy in the for loop. Now, before we test play this, I'm going to stop drawing the weapon collision rectangle. Remember, we're calling draw rectangle lines here in the character's tick function. I'm going to remove that. And now let's give this a test run. All right, here come the enemies. And they're pretty quick, so if you want them to be slower, you can adjust their speed variable. Let's see if we can destroy them. There we go. We saw that they were doing damage quite quickly, and we've already tested the game over scenario, so this is looking great. Okay, excellent job. We've now created this nice little 2D game, and really there's no limits on what you can do with this. You have the skills to add so many different features to this. There's no shortage of free 2D assets out there that you can use, and you've now learned the fundamentals of the C++ programming language. That's actually a pretty huge feat. So I would like to personally congratulate you for making it to the end of this series. I'd like you to give yourself a big pat on the back because you've come such a long way and you've learned quite a lot. So in summary, we've added multiple enemies to our game, and we've now finished the game. We've actually finished the section. In fact, we've finished the entire series. But have we finished learning? Of course not. We're never finished learning, right? I'd like to thank you for undergoing this journey with me. And again, you've done such an amazing job. It's been such a pleasure teaching you, and I hope to see you in future courses. Take care, and I'll see you soon.